Welcome to the channel English Epics. Damn, damn, damn. Matt knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and now the owner of the firm he worked for wanted to see him immediately. He got up and headed to Dan Connor's office. His thoughts were racing. There was no way Dan could have found out about this. As the accountant and chief manager, only Matt had seen the details of the company's transactions. And by the end of the month, all the accounts had been balanced. Matt broke into a sweat and felt sick as he reluctantly knocked on the door. He reminded himself that Dan never checked detailed reports unless there were obvious discrepancies in the balance sheets. He was always more concerned with his designer suits, fast cars, and chasing women. Dan looked serious and nodded toward the chair as Matt entered. The illusion of Matt's safety was shattered instantly. "I suppose I should ask, how long have you been stealing from me?" Matt's head started to spin. "What? I have no idea what you're talking about." He kept denying everything until Dan presented transaction records, proving that a significant amount of money had spent some time in one of Matt's personal accounts before being returned to the company. He realized he had been caught red-handed. "I'm so sorry, Dan. I just needed a short-term loan until the payday loan company got back to me. Otherwise, we would have lost the new house Susan was counting on. I didn't steal it. I returned it as soon as I could, and before the end of the month. I don't know how they'll classify this, Matt, as theft or fraud, but you're facing prison. Even without that, you could lose your job. I can't trust you after this. Please, give me a chance." It was a moment of madness. "I've worked for this company for nearly 20 years, and I've never done anything like this before. I swear I'll never do it again." Dan stood by the window, staring outside, seemingly deep in thought. "You and Susan have been my friends for a long time. I think that makes this situation even more disappointing. Did Susan know you did this?" Matt was surprised by the question. He hesitated. In truth, it had been Susan's idea. She was so desperate not to lose the house that she had suggested it, convincing Matt that no one would ever find out. For a moment, Matt considered that if Susan was involved, Dan might not report him to the police, but he didn't want to drag her into it. After a long pause, he finally said, "No, she doesn't know. It was my idea." Dan seemed surprised by Matt's answer, but let it pass. "I need time to think this over, Matt. I'm not sure what the best course of action is. Go home. Don't come back until the end of the week. I'll make my decision by Friday." All the way home, Matt couldn't figure out how Dan had found out. No one ever reviewed the transactions, and Dan certainly never paid attention to the details. But more than anything, Matt was worried about what Dan would decide. Neither of the options was particularly appealing, but the thought of a public trial and prison sent Matt into a blind panic. He knew Susan wouldn't wait for him. Staring at their new house, he deeply regretted ever buying the damn thing. Suddenly, all those stories about men coming home early in the morning only to discover their wife having an affair flashed through his mind. Wouldn't that be the perfect ending to an already disastrous day? Fortunately, when he walked into the kitchen, Susan was just as bright, cheerful, and, most importantly, fully dressed as usual. Once again, he was struck by her beauty. She had just turned 40. Her long, wavy chestnut hair was styled perfectly, cascading over her deep brown eyes. He still admired her figure, which had gained a few more curves and a far more generous neckline than when they had first married. But what he loved most was her smile, the one he was about to wipe off her face for the foreseeable future. Matt told Susan about his conversation with Dan and the evidence he had against him. Susan replied, "Oh my God, darling, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. It was my idea, all because of this stupid house." Matt shrugged. "I told Dan you didn't know anything. There's no point in dragging both of us into this mess." Susan hesitated. "Maybe if I talk to him and ask him to reconsider." Matt thought for a moment, but suggested they just wait. He knew these would be the longest 3 days of his life. If Dan decided to destroy him, then they could try begging for mercy. He wondered what he would do if he were in Dan's position. Outside of work, They had been friends. They often met up, attended parties together. Maybe that gave him a small chance. Then Dan sent a text message. He would be coming to their house at 7:00 p.m. on Friday. Both Matt and Susan felt sick with anticipation. Dan's Aston Martin pulled up to the house right on time. A man who has everything, Matt thought. Good looks, money, charm, and now the power to destroy me. He let Dan step inside, exchanged a few tense greetings, and, as usual, Susan offered him a beer. Before Dan could say anything, Matt spoke first. I just want to say that I'm truly sorry, Dan. I let you down. I let myself down, and I understand that I've put myself in a desperate situation. I'll accept whatever decision you make. Dan gave a strange smile. I really hope that's true, Matt. A long silence followed, stretching further and further, becoming unbearable, until Dan finally continued. You know, I envy you a little, Matt, your relationship with Susan. That's something I don't have in my life. Matt was surprised. He had always assumed Dan had everything, including an endless string of beautiful girlfriends. Maybe, now that he was approaching 30, he was thinking about settling down. So, given all this, I have a proposal. Neither of you will like it, but it's the only way you can avoid prison, Matt. And remember, there's a risk for Susan, too, since the account was joint and used to secure the house in both your names. I also know you wouldn't have done this without her agreement. Matt panicked at the thought of Susan being held accountable. He had no idea what Dan's proposal could entail. Dan took a slow, deep breath. This isn't easy to say, but my proposal is, I want to spend time with Susan. A stunned silence filled the room. Dan continued. No police, no court cases, no prison. You keep your job, you stay together. But I get to spend every Friday night with her. You can't be serious, Matt whispered. Dan's expression didn't waver. I'm completely serious. I've wanted Susan for years, and this is an opportunity one simply can't pass up. Susan spoke up, her voice unsteady. There has to be another option. We can pay more, anything, but... Dan, this is my only offer. I've been told I'm not bad looking. I hope it won't be too much of a burden for you. Maybe once. The dust settles. This arrangement won't be too inconvenient for any of us. Susan, we need time to think this over. We can't make a decision like this quickly. Matt shook his head. You can't even be considering this, baby. Have you lost your mind? Susan sighed. I don't see any alternatives, darling, and we've been trying to come up with one all week. Matt muttered through clenched teeth, glaring at Dan. You pathetic, worthless scumbag. This is a sick idea. Dan smirked. Maybe it is, Matt. But I'm not a thief. You are. Dan turned to Susan. If we're doing this, it starts right now. You don't have time to figure out a way out of it. After 15 minutes of shouting and accusations, Dan stood up. Time to decide. Either I walk to my car, or I go upstairs with Susan. He smiled and held out his hand to her. After a moment of hesitation, Susan took it. Matt was absolutely stunned and collapsed back into his chair. Susan, Matt, we don't have a choice. Everything will be fine. Then she led Dan through the living room and up the stairs. Time seemed to stop for Matt. The room was silent. Had this conversation really just happened? His thoughts jumped to what was going on upstairs. He heard the moving, muffled conversation, and then the unmistakable sound of someone sitting on the bed. Long minutes passed in silence before he heard the first creak of the mattress, the unmistakable sound of two people beginning to have sex. The movements and sounds continued. Then the creaking became rhythmic, accompanied by muffled moans growing faster and louder. It felt endless, and Matt wondered if he was losing his mind. Finally, a loud, "Yes, damn it!" and a moan signaled that Dan had reached his goal. Shame and guilt washed over Matt. He wiped his cheeks and eyes, waiting for Dan and Susan to come back downstairs. But instead, he heard more muffled voices and movement. After a long silence, Matt stood up, thinking he should check if Susan was okay, when he heard it again, the bed creaking. He approached the foot of the stairs and heard something else, snippets of Dan's voice. "That's it, baby. This time you're going to ride me." But the most unsettling sound was Susan's steady whimpering, occasionally broken by murmured yes and MMM. Matt needed to get out of the house. He hurried outside and wandered aimlessly down the street. Was Susan actually enjoying this, or was she just putting on a show for Dan? He started to wonder how strongly she had really objected to the idea. He couldn't ignore the fact that Dan was 10 years younger than him, and handsome. By the time he reached the park, his thoughts had shifted. Susan was doing this to keep him out of prison. He needed to go back home and make sure she was okay. Dan's Aston Martin was still parked outside, but the house was silent when Matt walked in. He went into the kitchen and grabbed a beer. Turning around, he saw Susan standing behind him in a short robe. They looked at each other, both feeling awkward, before Matt managed to speak. "Are you okay?" Susan gave a faint smile. "Yes, thanks for asking," she said, then added, "He's being decent. Nothing rough or weird, just regular sex. Sorry if you heard anything." Matt shrugged. "At least it's over." Susan looked uncomfortable and hesitated before responding. "Actually, he wants to do it again. He was thirsty, so I came down to grab a beer and check on you." "Jesus, he must have been saving up for you." Susan sighed. "Why don't you go to the den? It might be easier for you there. Maybe quieter. See if you can come up with a way out of this." Matt stayed in the room for another hour, making no progress in finding a solution. Then he heard footsteps coming down the stairs. He stepped into the hallway and saw Dan suppress a smirk before breaking the awkward silence. "Look, I know this isn't easy for you, Matt. I promise I'll treat Susan with complete respect, and I can't thank you enough for letting me spend time with her. I hope this gets easier for you, and of course, business matters will stay between us." Matt replied, "Don't thank me. You didn't leave us a choice." Dan and Susan both looked uncomfortable. It was clear it was time for him to leave. To Matt's surprise, as Dan said goodbye, Susan kissed him. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it was on the lips and lingered for a second. Before Matt could say anything, Dan was gone. He turned to Susan. "What the hell was that?" Susan realized she had made a mistake. "What?" "Oh, that was just a goodbye kiss." "No, not just that. It was affectionate. I guess you had a great time, and I shouldn't have been so worried." Susan's expression darkened. "I can't believe that after your boss just hit me 3 times, because of your actions, you're worried about a damn goodbye kiss." Matt clenched his jaw. This was supposed to be a deal, an arrangement, just sex. "Did you kiss him upstairs?" Susan hesitated. "Maybe a little, but not much." "Matt, great. First it happens multiple times, then I hear you enjoying it, and now there's affection too." Susan snapped, furious. "That's not how it is. Everything I'm doing is to keep us out of prison. I have to show enthusiasm and make sure he enjoys it. And besides, I can't help but moan if he's doing that to me. It's not exactly a voluntary reaction. I can control. We both have to get used to this. If I can go through it, then you need to find a way to deal with it too." Her last remark drained all the energy from Matt. Despite his doubts about her actions, Susan was the one making the sacrifice, not him. She could have just walked away, and where would that have left him? Possibly in prison. Matt couldn't stand being in the master bedroom, knowing what had happened there. So they slept in the guest room, holding each other close. Susan fell asleep, quickly, undoubtedly exhausted. Matt, on the other hand, didn't sleep at all. His mind was in turmoil, desperately trying to find a way out of this nightmare. It seemed like they barely spoke to each other all week, except for discussing how to get out of this mess. Matt kept coming up with different plans, most of which were useless. Even when he thought of a viable solution, Dan always seemed to be one step ahead. One idea involved destroying all the evidence, only for Matt to find out that Dan had already revoked his access to the backups and claimed to have secured all financial data in a new protected cloud system. Eventually, Friday arrived, and Dan sent a text saying he planned to take Susan out to dinner, under the pretense that it would make the situation easier to handle. Matt wasn't sure if it was any easier. On one hand, a dinner date felt too much like a real relationship. On the other, it meant less time in bed with Susan. As it turned out, he got the worst of both. Susan looked deeply uneasy about the idea of a date, but she still got ready. Matt thought she put in way too much effort. She looked too good when Dan arrived to pick her up. Watching her step into Dan's Aston Martin in a little black dress and stiletto heels was gut-wrenching. The evening that followed was even worse. He sent Susan multiple messages, asking if she was okay. Each time, he got a short reply saying she was fine, just having dinner or just having a drink. Finally, they returned at 10 p.m. Dan had his arm around Susan as they walked into the house, both laughing, seemingly in a good mood. Matt took a hard look at her. Susan definitely seemed to have enjoyed herself a little too much. She was tipsy. Maybe even drunk. "We never agreed these would be dates," he said bitterly. Dan smirked. "Relax, Matt. It was just dinner and drinks between friends. If this is too awkward for you, maybe we should just go upstairs right away," Matt growled. "What do you mean right away?" Dan's smirk returned. "We agreed on every Friday, Matt. So tonight I'll be sleeping with Susan and you. Well, I'm sure you'll manage in the spare room." Drunk or not, Susan sensed the tension. Fearing Matt might lunge at Dan, she quickly led him into the kitchen, whispering, "It'll be fine, darling. I'll take care of him quickly, then pretend I'm too drunk and go to sleep. Remember, we don't have a choice." Matt retreated, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of powerlessness. He heard them going upstairs, heard Susan giggling, something he hoped was just an act for Dan. But he couldn't help but wonder, was it for Dan or for him? Exhausted, Matt finally lay down in the spare room. Every time he woke up, he could hear the bed creaking in the master bedroom. So much for taking care of it quickly. The next morning, when he came downstairs, Dan was already sitting at the table while Susan made breakfast. That was it. "Get lost, Dan. It's not Friday anymore. Your time is up," Susan started. "There's no need for this, Matt. We can be civil. Just—" Matt cut her off. "You have 10 seconds to get out of my house." Dan looked like he was about to argue, but eventually stood up to leave. As he stepped through the door, he gave Matt a pointed reminder. "Don't forget what you stand to lose, Matt." Matt turned to Susan, making him breakfast. "Seriously? You've got to be kidding me. Why don't you just move in with him? You're more his wife than mine now." He stormed out before she could even think of a response. By the third Friday, Dan suggested they spend the night at a hotel to avoid further confrontations with Matt. Susan left at 6 p.m., dressed as usual, thinking it would make things easier for Matt. The plan was for her to change in the hotel room before meeting Dan at the restaurant. She was a little overwhelmed by the luxury of the hotel. Her casual outfit felt out of place in such an elegant setting. After collecting the key to the pre-booked room, she entered and found that it was a suite. A bouquet of flowers sat on the table, and 2 gift-wrapped boxes were placed on the bed. Opening the larger box, she discovered an exquisite floor-length, silver satin gown, glamorous and undoubtedly expensive, with a halter neckline and a thigh-high slit. The second box contained a red satin corset, matching thong, and luxurious black-seamed stockings. She hesitated, but decided there was no harm in trying them on. To her surprise, everything fit perfectly, and she had to admit she felt incredible wearing them. She made up her mind not to change back and headed downstairs to the restaurant. Dan greeted her, momentarily stunned, his mouth slightly open. at how breathtaking she looked. The dinner that followed, paired with fine wine, was exquisite. Yet the atmosphere remained charged with tension, both of them fully aware of what would come next. In Dan's company, Susan found herself feeling more at ease. Instead of resisting, she made a decision to embrace the situation rather than fight it. When they returned to the suite, Dan undressed her slowly, moving with deliberate sensuality. She enjoyed his reaction to her lingerie, his hands gliding over her body, lingering on the curves accentuated by the corset. She loved how it highlighted her chest and hips, and the stockings felt so luxurious, so exquisitely silky against her skin. She had to admit, Dan was an attentive and skilled lover, exuding a confidence and edge of danger she had never experienced with her husband. The next morning, after another round of sex, Susan changed back into her everyday clothes. She explained to Dan that she couldn't risk taking the dress or lingerie home. Dan agreed to keep them at his place for her future use. Susan sighed, reminded that this was now a long-term arrangement. Her emotions were in turmoil. She wasn't sure how she felt about any of it. There was plenty of guilt, of course, but she couldn't deny the sense of satisfaction. Matt lay awake for most of Friday night. By 10 a.m. on Saturday, Susan still hadn't returned. Once again, this was beyond what had been agreed upon. He doubted Dan would resist the chance to be with Susan again that morning, and he wasn't sure she would even try to avoid it. No matter how much he fought against it, he was losing trust in her, and if that happened, it could mean the end of their marriage. He had never felt so distant from Susan. Never felt so alone. Susan. That kiss had been such a mistake, it upset Matt more than anything else, and then making breakfast for Dan. What was I thinking? She was starting to believe that this entire arrangement had been a terrible idea. From her perspective, spending time with Dan had been easier than she expected. He was charming, attractive, and engaging. The money and luxury cars certainly helped. She had always been drawn to the finer things in life. Her real dilemma, though, was the fact that sex with him was hot. Very hot. It was a constant battle not to scream, not to moan too loudly, and not to beg for more. She had hoped that Matt would get used to what was happening and come to terms with it, but 3 weeks had passed, and he remained withdrawn. They also hadn't made love, something she desperately wanted to fix. She loved him so much and regretted the situation they had found themselves in. She tried to reassure Matt, telling him she was handling it and that he shouldn't feel guilty. Then she added that Dan treated her well, that it was just sex, not love, and that he had no intention of tearing them apart. But none of it made a difference. Matt looked defeated, lost. The warm, supportive presence he had always been in her life was starting to feel like a distant memory. On Monday, when he arrived at work, Dan informed Matt that he needed to attend a training event out of town the following Wednesday and Thursday. Matt immediately felt suspicious, but given his precarious position at work, he had no choice but to agree. Fine, I can do it. But this doesn't change anything about our personal arrangement. You can't come over when I'm not home, Dan replied. Smoothly, of course not. When Matt told Susan about it that evening, she didn't seem surprised or concerned. Training events weren't common, but they did happen once or twice a year. Still, to Matt, the timing felt too convenient. He went to the kitchen, intending to strategize a way out of this mess, but his thoughts lost the battle to a blinding headache. As he headed back upstairs to find some painkillers, he overheard Susan on the phone. Curious about who she was speaking to, he paused at the top of the stairs and listened to her side of the conversation. What are you doing? Sending Matt away on a trip? No, that's a bad idea. Nothing is working, and your visit will only make things worse. No, he hasn't figured anything out yet. It looks like he's given up and accepted it. I thought it would be different. He's completely devastated. You know, I enjoy the time we spend together. I know this was my idea, but I didn't expect him to be this upset. This was supposed to be a safe alternative to our affair. No risk of being caught. I never anticipated all of this. I helped you with the kisses and the breakfast, and meanwhile you acted like an arrogant jerk smirking in his face. Fine, you can come over while he's away, but after that, I think we need to tone this down. Maybe even stop altogether. If you suggest ending this arrangement because you see what it's doing to Matt, then you'll be the good guy, and we can go back to normal. Maybe, if you're careful, we could still meet up from time to time. We'll talk later, but I really need to fix things with Matt. I still love him. Matt staggered down the stairs, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. Had he really just heard all that? He couldn't even begin to process the full weight of it. No wonder Dan always seemed to be one step ahead. Susan had been telling him everything in advance, and after all, this had been her idea. She had suggested it and convinced Matt to take the money, despite his better judgment. That also explained how Dan had discovered the discrepancy in the first place. It was buried so deep that Matt had believed even an audit wouldn't uncover it. If he hadn't been married to a saint who had saved him from prison, then the truth was far worse. He was married to a deceiver, a cunning, manipulative traitor. Thoughts of revenge raced through his mind. Everything was crashing down on him, but he knew he had to stay calm, think rationally. He needed a plan, one that would make them start feeling uneasy. For the rest of the night and into the next morning, Matt avoided Susan completely. When Matt saw Susan on Tuesday evening, he didn't mention the phone call he had overheard. Instead, he told her that he had heard Dan bragging at work about having some first-class mistress. Matt went on, saying that he could only pray Dan hadn't mentioned her name. On Wednesday morning, Matt left early for his trip. Susan told him she loved him. He gave a brief smile but pretended to be distracted, checking his schedule on his phone as he headed out. Dan arrived at Susan's place later that morning. Right away, she asked about the bragging, but Dan denied everything, accusing Matt of blowing things out of proportion. Susan didn't know whom to believe. She saw no reason why. Matt would make it up, but maybe Dan had been less discreet than she had thought, which would be a serious problem. Between rounds of sex, they discussed the situation and what they could do about it. Susan missed the emotional connection she had with Matt. What she had with Dan was purely physical. Before leaving on Thursday afternoon, Dan convinced Susan to continue their affair. But Susan made it clear. This would be the last time, at least until things were back on track with Matt. As Dan stepped outside, he froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. A large kitchen knife lay across the gleaming hood of his Aston Martin. He looked around, but the street was empty. All 4 tires had been slashed. He rushed back inside and told Susan. Panic set in for both of them. Matt could have come home, early. What did he know? It had to be him, unless it was just kids or someone jealous of the flashy car. This wasn't the first act of vandalism in the area. Susan immediately called Matt, casually asking how the training had gone. He casually replied that it had been boring, that he didn't even need to be there, and that he was already packing to head home. His voice was calm, too calm. He didn't even ask about Dan. Susan told him she couldn't wait to see him and ended the call. She relayed the conversation to Dan, saying Matt didn't sound upset. Maybe it was just kids after all. Either way, they needed to get the car towed before Matt got home. That led to a flurry of frantic calls and some very expensive repairs. Everything seemed normal when Matt returned home on Thursday evening. Susan tiptoed around him, playing the role of the dutiful wife. The real surprise came when Dan messaged to confirm that he still planned to come over on Friday, but only to discuss the situation. Susan smiled, thinking that maybe Dan was finally ready to put an end to all of this. Maybe the incident with his car had scared him enough to walk away. On Friday morning, Matt left for work as usual. At 11 a.m., he called Susan from the office, his voice shaken and frantic. "You need to see something." Matt explained that he had just received a video clip in their personal email, something she needed to watch. Susan quickly opened their email on her phone, found the message, and tapped on the attachment. The video quality was poor, lasting only 40 seconds, but there was no mistaking it. It was her and Dan having sex. The sender was anonymous. Matt, Jesus, is that our bedroom? It's hard to tell, but it looks bright, like midday, so I'm not sure when this could have been. Susan knew exactly when it was. She clearly remembered Dan being with her like that on Wednesday. But instead, she replied, I'm not sure. Maybe it's been edited, and they messed with the lighting. Matt, that's you, isn't it? You look like you're enjoying it. Susan ignored the comment. She had bigger concerns right now. She could explain her enthusiasm to Matt later as part of the act she had put on for Dan. Matt, what is Dan playing at? Is this what he wanted to discuss tonight? Is this just another form of torture? You didn't say anything to him, did you? You didn't threaten him. Susan immediately denied it, then paused. She had told Dan she planned to end things. Maybe he hadn't taken it well. Maybe he intended to use the video to force her to continue. At some point, he must have set up a camera. He'd had plenty of opportunities over those 2 days to do it. Matt said that Dan wasn't at work, so he couldn't confront him about it. Susan desperately wanted to get in touch with him. She still hoped they could discuss what had happened over the past few days. Just then, her phone buzzed with a message. Call me urgently. It was from her sister, Diana. Susan told Matt she needed to take the call, hoping it would buy her some time to think. She ended the conversation with Matt and called Diana back, only to be met with a barrage of questions and expletives. When Diana finally stopped to catch her breath, Susan managed to piece together what was happening. Her sister had received the same video clip. Her phone kept buzzing with incoming calls. Most of her close friends were trying to reach her, even her mother. Oh my God, did they all get the clip? This was a complete disaster. Matt would never do this to me. It has to be Dan. Furious, Susan repeatedly tried calling Dan, but he wasn't answering. The reason Susan couldn't reach Dan was that Matt had taken his phone at work while Dan was in a meeting. He had tossed the battery into a trash can, keeping the phone and SIM card for himself. He had also left an envelope on Dan's desk before. Calling Susan about the video, then quietly walked out of the office. Back home, Matt took great satisfaction in watching his wife unravel in confusion and distress. She was devastated that her mother had seen the video and that all her friends and family would now believe she was having an affair. Matt played along, offering various useless suggestions on how to contain the damage, all while planting his own doubts about when the video could have been recorded. Susan still hadn't admitted that Dan had visited her midweek Susan. How had everything gone so horribly wrong? She had never even considered having an affair until she got drunk at a party and flirted way too much with Dan. He was handsome, charming, and very interested. After that night, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Over the next few weeks, she managed to convince herself that she deserved some satisfaction, but she wasn't reckless enough to risk her marriage to Matt. She had seen her friend's marriage fall apart after a similar affair was exposed, but she had always been smart. She had thought her plan was the perfect way to avoid all the pitfalls of being caught. After all, how could Matt discover something he already knew about? Working out the details had been a challenge, but that was part of the thrill. From her perspective, it had been the perfect arrangement. What she hadn't considered was what it would do to Matt. Now she was in agony. Matt was well-liked. Everyone knew he had been betrayed. The thought of trying to explain herself, trying to talk her way out of this, filled her with dread. No one would ever believe that Matt had known about her affair with Dan, but none of that mattered. As long as she could convince Matt that this wasn't her fault. The screech of Dan's tires announced his arrival at Matt and Susan's house. Susan met him at the door, immediately launching herself at him in fury. Matt made no effort to stop her, noting the deep scratch on Dan's cheek. Eventually, Dan managed to pin Susan against the wall just long enough to get a word in. He had heard about the video, but insisted he hadn't filmed it or sent it. Susan snapped. Then if it wasn't you, who the hell? Matt started laughing. Well, I guess that would be me. Susan and Dan froze, looking stunned. Dan was the first to recover. "So you found out about our little midweek meeting?" "Matt, oh yes. Unfortunately, I did." Susan immediately tried to justify it as just part of their arrangement, but Dan had already realized the full implications of the video. They had discussed the whole situation. Matt had definitely recorded everything. Trying to smooth things over, Dan softened his tone. "Matt, I'm really sorry. I couldn't resist, Susan. I never meant for this to hurt you like this." I made a terrible lapse in judgment. I got carried away. "I'll end the arrangement, and I won't pursue the financial discrepancies." "Matt, that's so kind of you, Dan. But I'm afraid it's far too late. You'll find my resignation letter on your desk." Susan jumped in. "You can't, Matt. How are we going to pay for the house?" "Matt, don't worry about that, dear. It's going on the market tomorrow." Dan shot up from his seat. "That's not necessary, Matt. We can move past this. I need you at the firm. You know the business and the clients inside out." Matt smirked. "I suppose that's true. Maybe that's why your biggest competitor just offered me a job. I suspect that some, maybe even most of your clients will be coming with me. And considering the vacation days you still owe me, I won't be back for the 4-week notice period." Dan's forced smile faded. Matt continued. "Matt, I suspect some employees will leave too. I've already told them I'm quitting, and most of them don't seem to think you have what it takes to keep the company running." Dan stiffened. "You need to think this through, Matt. You could still end up in jail." "Matt, oh, I don't think so. Would you really want to drag your mistress into this? She benefited just as much from the fraud as I did. Besides, you committed extortion, and thanks to your little stunt here today, I now have a recorded confession. Amazing what kind of tech you can buy these days. The recording is already with my lawyer. Oh, and you might also find that some of your files have been accidentally deleted, and since I know you never set up remote backups, well, good luck with that. It's nice having colleagues who actually like working with you, but I suppose you wouldn't know much about that." Dan smirked. "That recording will never hold up in court." Matt smirked. "Funny enough, my lawyer said the same thing, but I don't need it for court. I can use it for other purposes. And by the time this all plays out, you'll already be out of business. Then again, my new firm might just want to buy you out. I hear their new chief operating officer is a decent guy." Susan realized that compared to Dan, Matt's business and financial standing were now a real threat. She made a split-second decision to throw Dan under the bus. Dan watched in disbelief as Susan launched into an impressive performance as the betrayed wife. "I love you, Matt. This was all Dan's idea. He forced me into it. I admit I got confused. I got caught up in it a little, but I only went through with it to save you from prison. I had no choice, and now my life is falling apart because of it. Please, Matt, I love you," Dan muttered under his breath. "You two-faced, lying wretch. Ah, my dear, loving wife. In addition to the video, you seem to be forgetting that I overheard your phone call where you admitted this was all your idea, a well-planned and cruel cover for your affair. You'll find the divorce papers in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. You're leaving tonight, and you will agree to the terms. Otherwise, those video clips might just find their way to our friends and family. I'm sure your dear mother would love to know that you're not just a cheating adulteress, but also how far you went, how calculated and manipulative you were." Susan collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Matt turned to Dan. "You want to take her with you?" Dan scoffed. "Not a chance. She's more trouble than she's worth." Matt chuckled. "For once, I agree with you." Dan narrowed his eyes. "This isn't over, Matt." Matt nodded. "That's true." And at that moment, Matt swung. Neither of them was sure who was more surprised when his fist slammed into Dan's jaw, sending him crashing to the floor. Now it's over. Matt listened to the recording several times. Most of it was painful, but he particularly enjoyed the part where Dan and Susan panicked, wondering if he had found out and lost his mind. The knife in the hood of Dan's car had been wonderfully melodramatic. For the first time in weeks, Matt smiled. He had, in fact, taken a job with Dan's biggest competitor. Clients and employees followed him. Dan fought to keep his company afloat, but in the end, he was forced to place it under administrative control. Rumors spread about his personal bankruptcy. Shortly after, he left town. Susan remained in a small apartment, living off the money from the sale of their house, but without a single cent from Matt. With no qualifications and no experience, she ended up working 2 temporary jobs as a housekeeper and a waitress. Her former friends avoided her. She barely spoke to her mother or her sister anymore. A salary increase and bonuses allowed Matt to switch to a 3-day work week, giving him time to focus on sports and outdoor activities, things he had neglected during his marriage. He hadn't realized just how much Susan had influenced his decisions, from buying a massive house to filling it with stuff. But he wasted no time selling it. He remained in touch with Susan's mother and sister. Diana, in particular, constantly apologized for her sister's betrayal, assuring him she would never make the same mistake. Matt couldn't help but wonder exactly what she meant by that. It might be fun to find out one day, especially since it would drive Susan insane. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epics. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.